feel my heart race every time I think about that fateful night when we dared to play with a Ouija board. It was a chilly autumn evening, the wind rustling through the trees and carrying a sense of unease that seemed to match our own. We gathered in my friend Sarah's dimly lit living room, the atmosphere already heavy with anticipation and a touch of fear. The Ouija board sat on the coffee table before us, its presence like a looming specter. The room was bathed in the flickering glow of candles, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. The planchette, cool and smooth beneath our fingertips, rested on the board, its very presence a conduit to the unknown. With nervous laughter, we placed our hands on the planchette and started asking questions. At first, it felt like a game, the planchette gliding over the letters in response to our questions. We asked light-hearted queries, like whether anyone had a secret crush, and the planchette's movements were playful, almost innocent. But as the minutes ticked by, an unexplainable heaviness settled in the room. The air grew still, and a sense of being watched seemed to seep into our consciousness. The planchette began to move more purposefully, spelling out words that none of us were spelling consciously. It was as if some invisible force was guiding our hands. My friend David asked, "Who are you?" The planchette halted for a moment, then slowly spelled out a name none of us recognized. The air seemed to grow colder, and a knot of dread formed in my stomach. A feeling of unease crept over us, but like moths drawn to a flame, we couldn't tear ourselves away from the board. As the questions continued, the planchette's movements grew more forceful, almost aggressive. It spelled out sentences that seemed to weave a narrative of darkness and tragedy. I could feel a tension in the room, a palpable fear that hung in the air like a heavy fog. It was as if something had crossed over from the other side, and we were no longer in control. "Are you a spirit?" someone dared to ask. The planchette's response sent a shockwave of terror through us. It spelled out "no" in jagged, uneven movements. The realization hit us like a sledgehammer. We were in communication with something beyond our understanding, something that had its own intentions. The planchette began to move more rapidly, spelling out words that formed sentences that made no logical sense. It was as if a malevolent intelligence was trying to communicate, its messages cryptic and foreboding. Panic began to grip us, but it was as if an invisible force held us captive, compelling us to stay connected to the board. At one point, the planchette spelled out my name, and a sense of icy dread washed over me. It was as if the entity knew us intimately. Our deepest fears and insecurities laid bare before it. The very air seemed charged with electricity, and I could feel a presence in the room. A presence that seemed to leer at us from the shadows. Finally, with trembling hands, we asked if we could end the session. The planchette's movements grew erratic, almost violent, spelling out "no" repeatedly. Desperation clawed at us as we tried to break the connection, our fingers glued to the planchette as if by an invisible glue. With a final surge of determination, we forcefully pushed the planchette to goodbye and removed our hands. The room fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere dissipating as if the entity had been banished. We sat there, shaken to our cores, the weight of what we had just experienced settling heavily upon us. It was a moonless night, the stars hidden behind a shroud of clouds as my friends and I ventured into the heart of an abandoned asylum. The building stood as a decaying monument to forgotten horrors, its windows like eyes that stared into the void. The Ouija board awaited us, a portal to the other side, illuminated by the wavering glow of flickering candles. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the distant sound of a howling wind seemed to carry the whispers of the past. With a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, we placed our fingers on the planchette, its cold touch sending shivers down our spines. Our first question was hesitant, a mere murmur in the shadows. "Is there anyone here?" The planchette remained still, as if the very walls were holding their breath, and then as if the building itself was awakening. The planchette began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out "yes." A collective gasp rippled through us, our breaths suspended in a shared moment of dread. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a quiver. The planchette moved again, forming a name that sent a chill racing down my spine. It was a name that had been etched into the annals of the asylum's dark history, a name associated with unspeakable acts and unending suffering. The weight of the past seemed to press upon us like a suffocating shroud. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air had been tainted by the building's malevolent history. The planchette's movements grew more forceful, spelling out words that formed sentences filled with a grim intelligence. We dared to ask about the spirit's intentions, and its responses carried a darkness that seemed to seep into our very souls. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements fluid and unsettling. The candles flickered as if they were fighting against the presence that had joined us in the room. The temperature dropped, and the air seemed to carry the whispers of long-forgotten voices, echoing with pain and anguish. A feeling of being watched from the shadows gnawed at the edges of our minds. With trepidation, we inquired if the spirit meant us harm. The planchette's response was an ominous yes. Fear surged through us like a torrent, but it was as if an invisible force held us captive, compelling us to continue. A force that now held dominion over the board and us. The planchette moved with an urgency, spelling out words that conveyed a malevolence beyond our understanding. It spoke of suffering, vengeance, and a thirst for release from its eternal torment. As we listened to the messages being spelled out, a sense of doom settled over us, as if we were trapped in a nightmare from which we could not awaken. At one point, the planchette spelled out a phrase that sent a shockwave of terror through us. "You will join us." It was a promise, a threat that seemed to echo through the very walls of the asylum. Panic and desperation clawed at our minds, and it was clear that we were in the presence of an entity that sought to claim us as its own. As we tried to sever the connection, the planchette resisted, moving with an unnatural force, spelling out "No" repeatedly. Our struggle intensified, our fingers feeling as though they were glued to the planchette, ensnared in an otherworldly grip that refused to let go. With a final surge of determination, we pushed the planchette to goodbye and removed our hands. The room fell into an eerie silence, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if the entity had been banished. We were left shaken, our hearts racing, the weight of what we had just experienced settling upon us like a curse.